Okej, så då sitter du och jag här, din kära haveristvän Ivar Arpi, mannen med det röda skägget. Och nu har vi faktiskt fått en internationell gäst här, så vi kan byta om till engelska. So, we're gonna switch over to English, so...
that's good.
No, yeah.
So I can understand something.
Yeah.
Of course.
So this is the next segment of the panel, or sorry, the conversational program here at the Young Leaders Academy, arranged by Oikos and sponsored by New Direction. And today we're gonna sort of continue on the theme which you sort of talked about a bit in your earlier presentation, which is this sort of march of wokeness and the cultural struggles surrounding that. But before that, there's actually a fairly interesting personal journey you've made, which I think that speaks a bit about our sort of political and economical sort of moment we're living in. So you were at one point, fairly recently, a establishment journalist, like a conventional sort of, 9-to-5 guy, as much as that is the reality inside of journalism, which is probably not 100%. But you worked at the second largest daily newspaper, right?
Yes, Svenska Dagbladet. I was an editorial writer between basically from 2013 to December 2020. And I got a job offer. I said no a few times, and then it was from Bulletin, which is struggling right now.
This was a very dark period in Swedish history that we, like Voldemort, you're not supposed to talk about.
Yes.
Because then you can bring great evil down upon you. But moving on from that very, unfortunate.
But I just have to say it was a great opportunity. Many of my friends had started with Bulletin. It's a right-wing newspaper. It was very promising. Many of those people I still respect, and I mean our social relations are intact mostly, and we still like each other, and they are still great. But I quit because I didn't like the owner, basically, and he's a jackass and an idiot. Now he's not here to defend himself,
which is good.
Which is good because he can't. Yeah. He's become a dimwit. But moving on, I'm very thankful that I quit my establishment journalist job. I would have done the same 100 times out of 100, because now I've moved on to Substack, which I didn't know even existed. Which is basically where people who have been deplatformed in the Anglo-Saxon sphere, in the Anglosphere, they from New York Times, Barry Weiss left New York Times, and Andrew Sullivan, he left because he wrote an article and his editors demanded not to depublish or unpublish the article, but that he should mark his distance towards what he wrote. So both of them migrated to Substack, and it's a combined publication and also a newsletter. Where you can people can subscribe, and they can also pay. So you can have paying subscribers and free subscribers, and it's become very profitable for Andrew Sullivan and Barry Weiss, and I don't complain, but Swedish is a kind of a smaller language than English, so it's hard. It's not the same growth potential, but it's very interesting what's happening. That I basically now have my only boss right now is my subscribers, so I have a direct relation with my subscribers in a way I've never had before, and. So if you're writing for a big newspaper, basically, if you compare it to trying to pick up someone at a bar, you have to ask someone, is it okay if I sit down? But when they're subscribing to your newsletter, you're already sitting down. So it's an ongoing conversation you can have with your readers. So you have a close relationship. And there's no one to say that, oh, this one this piece is straying from our ideological framework. If I want to investigate something, I can do that. And if I want to make more journalistic, because I'm moving a little bit, I've been moving more towards writing more journalistically, because I think there's a need for that in the right wing, and I also think that people's minds change when they find out new facts a lot, and so you need to do more investigation yourself, and nobody can stop me from it now.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing about this is just that, as you sort of correctly pointed out, Substack is kind of a combination of a newsletter, it's a subscriber service, but it's also not like unfriendly to this sort of long form essay format. So it's kind of a blog and a newsletter platform. And
a podcast platform.
Yeah.
I have a podcast as well.
Yeah. So it's kind of a one-stop shop of like a lot of sort of self-published things. We've had like during the early 2000s, like one period where blogging, like the blog roll and stuff like that, was pretty like sizable, and then those people got absorbed into media, and now we have another exodus into this sort of wild west of Substack, and you've done really well in that environment, and it's an interesting environment because it sort of tells you that like these old left, right, as well as the institutional sort of foundations for those things are slowly, I would say, like almost breaking down. Because at this point, what really shines through in a lot of politics today is that like the old like friend-enemy distinctions, like the left is supposed to be the party of the working class, and then like all of these sort of COVID regulations hit, you have workers, striking, organizing protests and so on. And then suddenly the left says, workers, they're kind of bad. Then they should probably have less power. And, strikes, that's so, 20th century. We shouldn't do strikes. Maybe they should be banned or abolished or something.
If it's not about race,
then
that's fine. Black Lives Matter, those protests, they are vital.
Yeah, and
according to this the new framework of thinking. Yeah,
and on the other end of the spectrum, you have the right, which is sort of locked in this. And this is really illustrated very well by the Tory party in Britain, where at one point you sort of start picking up all of these working class voters, and then you go, okay, so the Conservative Party is supposed to be the party of the workers now. I guess we'll have to sort of change with the times and adopt new policies to fit that. So this is a time where old categories are just not necessarily making as much sense as they used to. And I think that sort of ties into the journalistic journey you've made.
And I think that there is a couple of things that's happened, and internet, of course, and just to begin with the blogosphere, it was much smaller than people realized at the time, I think, because it was so basically it was to write a blog was a way to get a job in mainstream media, to show the bosses in mainstream media that, oh, look, I'm so talented, you can hire me. That's how I got a job. I blogged, and then I got a job. But now people can leave and take their readers with them, and they because there's a much larger portion of the population that's actually wants something else, and they are willing to pay for it. So you have a higher demand, and also older people today are much more online. So there's basically no big difference between someone who's 65 and someone who's 30 in the way they use new media on the internet. So that's one thing, that it's possible now to live on it. For if you're privileged enough to have gathered a larger audience. So that's one thing, and the bigger trend, I think, is beginning with the internet and then social media is that all the centers of power have been weakened, and they have tried to increase their hold, and they don't manage. So you have the view of an expert. The picture of an expert is someone who can tell you what's wrong and how things work and do the right thing. And we've had those kinds of leaders never really existed, but that was we thought that they existed. So we have like a nostalgia for strong leaders, even in Sweden, like our old social. You can see that when we talk about the Social Democrats used to be much better. They weren't much better, but there were no opposing views. So you had like a centralization going in all countries of the industrialized world from the 30s onwards. And it was true for the West as for the East. So you centralized power and you could control information. And what's happened in the last 20 years is that you cannot control information anymore. So what I think that happened also, you could see that we want that expert, but we will never have that again, because you can immediately check something online if it's true or not. And if you see, like, for example, now during COVID, you can see that Sweden, we departed from you can be thankful or you can think it was bad, but that we departed from the rest of the gang in our strategy.
Yeah.
And it's visible for everyone. So you can immediately check how are everybody else doing. What are experts in other countries saying? So when Swedish journalists write about the Swedish strategy, you can always check what other papers are writing about Sweden and about COVID. And that's new. That's very new. So the old centers of power have been toppled, but they don't know it. And this also ties into why I think Donald Trump, for example, was so effective. Is that the whole drain the swamp rhetoric is true. I mean, because you have a class of people who's in power, and it's different people in different countries, of course. But they've been in power for a long time, and they have, and they are drawn from the universities, and they work in the government agencies, they work in the government, they work at the universities, and so he could connect directly to people, to regular people, and this is also why a politician like Hanif Bali here in Sweden from the Moderate Party, why he's so popular among ordinary people, is because he actually talks like he's not the politician, and that's why he's also kicked out from his own party. Yeah. And he's been in steps kicked out from his own party.
Yeah, it's because marginalized.
Yes, because we need what we want, and what people want is authenticity, humility, and a way to the previous guest, Radoslav Fogelier. He talked about this, and he's from the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and you talked about it like you want democracy from the bottom up.
Yeah,
and that's the one thing that the way that government has been working during the 20th century, it can never supply. So the way things are working within the system will never satisfy that. And I think, I mean, now I will. I sound like I have hubris, but Substack is just one very, very small part of that, because the people know that I don't talk for anyone else now, and that's authenticity in a way. And I can have, if somebody's critical towards me, I can answer them directly, and if you have representatives in our democracy, they have to toe the party line. They have to. They can never be as authentic as people want them to be. That was a very long answer to something you didn't ask.
Yeah, I'm used to it, comrade Ivar. But I actually want to sort of, in the spirit of generosity here, expand on something you traced in what you just said, which I think is fairly significant, to sort of make the point stronger that Substack is part, like it's the tip of a much greater iceberg. The quest here, the thing driving demand is not necessarily authenticity, but there's also a sort of class dimension to this. And you mentioned this with like draining the swamp, and that there's a certain kind of people who occupy like these institutional seats of power, essentially. And they go to certain schools, they have a certain culture, and they are fairly jealous in terms of guarding that sort of access to power and a platform. And one of the things you are most well known for in Sweden, like one of the, I guess, probably the most prolific person in that field, except for perhaps
Showing my pug.
Yeah, well, that and also being a Van Gogh impersonator, but also as a distant third, talking about wokeness. You've written a book on the subject of like critical gender ideology and so on, sort of infiltrating institutions, which was the topic of your talk a couple of hours ago. And what I can sort of see as someone who writes on that issue from sort of a materialist perspective and
Are you still a Marxist, Malcolm?
I know it's horrible, but you know,
I once asked you, can you please expand on in which way you're still a Marxist? And you said, oh, I'm working on it. I will publish soon. Have you published the article?
I mean, we can sort of get into that now, actually, because the thing here is that you write about wokeness, and you've written a lot about it for a Swedish audience. And nowadays, I kind of write on that topic, in a sense, for an international one. And one of the things that the debate on woke ideas, gender, or critical race theory, as it's called in the US, norm critique, which is sort of a catch-all term in Swedish, is that if you think about like the intellectual dark web and those people in 2016 and then like to 2020, say, the idea was always that we're fighting a discrete set of ideas. And sometimes that was called cultural Marxism and so on. But essentially, people who go to the universities have been infected with these fairly pernicious, socially corrosive ideas. And they're really terrible ideas. And so we should, gather our wits and sort of argue against them. Because once we present people with better ideas, that will be the ball game. They won't be able to defend themselves. But that strategy has sort of shown its powerlessness, I would go so far as to say, because it turns out that it's not everyone, it's not some random trucker or dock worker or whatever who believes in critical race theory, for example. It's just this, what you call this class of people inside the swamp.
Yeah, it's basically like 10 or 20% of the population, but they are the ones who wield an outsized power. Yeah,
and so the right has sort of moved from this fairly idealistic sense of it's all a battle on the marketplace of ideas to sort of belatedly realizing, and this is very clear in the US, which is kind of why people ask me to write about this stuff a lot. It's very clear that people are realizing that, no, this is sort of a conflict between different social and economic classes, in a sense. And I think that, to answer your question about what makes me a Marxist, I do think that you sort of have to start analyzing those things in terms of people who are interested in critical race theory, for example, tend to have this view that you need to get more and more managers, consultants, ideological commissars, and so on working like inside the bureaucracies. Like the only way to fight racism or anything else is actually to expand the
institutional takeover.
And there was kind of a non-ideological example of this fairly recently when the Swedish mining company LKAB essentially wrote an application to expand like its mining operation. And that application cost 100 million Swedish crowns because it's such a incredibly convoluted process. So they had to hire a lot of people, pay a lot of money, spend like thousands of man hours on it. And then the application was denied because they had actually sent out too many invitations to the information meetings. Like they invited too many people to tell, like, we're going to expand this mine. And so the court said, well, you're not supposed to invite everyone in the city. You're only supposed to invite people in the city that are specifically
key groups.
Yeah. And so you have to do another 100 million application, my friends. You have to go back to square one. And when people get mad about that, it's obvious that they're not getting mad about, there's too little pollution in my drinking water. Like when I buy a fish, I'm not getting poisoned by mercury. And I think that as a conservative, that really insults me. It's that it takes 100 million crowns to do something like this. And then you have these bureaucrats who are looking for any way to squeeze another 100 million crowns out of the process.
I think if we take the class issue, this is something that it's interesting because you have this shift as you talked about with the Tories, and you can see this in people who are running for the Republican Party in the United States now, like Blake Masters, for example, and they are talking about the little man and big business, and the big business and banks and the financial system is not working for like working class and middle class Americans, and this is a very un-Republican way to phrase things. It used to be. But if you actually, Pew Research Center just came out with a new investigation of the different voting groups in the United States, which corresponds somewhat to the different political parties in Sweden. And you can see that you have a very large contingent, it's called a populist right, according to them. Perhaps it's right. And they are actually to the left of most of the Democratic voting groups when it comes to economic issues. They are very hard on migration, and they are very conservative in social issues, but they are very left-wing. And you can see this in Denmark as well. You have the Danish People's Party, which has taken a very... they have gone to the left in economic issues. And I would say that this is a new development that... because... And also, if you look at attitudes towards the big companies and capitalism generally, people on the left are getting more positive, and people on the right are getting more negative. So why is that? It's because the consensus within big business and within tech companies is going woke, and this is challenging also preconceptions and ideological frameworks that the right has been using for a long time, like. Property rights and stuff like that, because if you feel like the companies are actually in cahoots with the government when it comes to work, and they are meeting, and they are getting deals together to in certain areas, and like Facebook and Google and Twitter are meeting with government representatives. So, and they're very concerned about fake news and hate and extremism and stuff like that, and that's a reason that the right wing are starting to realize that the distinction between private and public is breaking down. Like the politics has to move into the private sphere as well. You can't say that No, that's a private company. When that private company, for example, is Twitter or Facebook or Google, because they are so huge now that they are more. It's like saying that they're like the roads we drive on. So what's happening right now is that the working class, and especially native working class, is becoming more right wing, and it's been happening for a while. But what's happening now as well is that the parties are also changing. Yeah. I think, and they are. One of the tragedies with Trump was that he said that he were going to drain the swamp, and he promised a lot of things in the 2016 election before, and he didn't follow through with all of them. Some of the things he should have done would have helped the working class and the middle class more, and he promised to do it, but he didn't.
Yeah, the interesting issue, and I'm glad you bring up the U.S. again, because it's kind of the canary in the coal mine, like the sort of example of this dynamic that has probably progressed the farthest. Like there's this tension right now between this sort of, well, the communists during the Cold War, they talked about class, and if we do, we might become communists as well. So, don't want to catch the cooties. Partly that, but also the idea, which is kind of flattering, which is that, all of these truckers in northern England, they've just discovered that they really like fish and chips and the Union Jack and being able to swear during a football game. And the woke Marxists, cultural Marxists, they're saying, no, if you go to a football game, you have to be like, completely respectful, and you can't do harmful chants to minorities. But it's not really that. At least this is not a struggle only in the realm of ideas, because to take the British example here, you had Labour essentially saying that we're the party of the working class, which is why we have to defend against Brexit, because Brexit cannot be in the interest of any working person whatsoever. And then, Brexit happens and everyone is awfully mad about it. And, a year later, most, truck drivers have gotten pay raises of, 15% or more. And then you sort of realize that, well, actually, it turns out that Labour was kind of hoping that truckers would never get those pay rises, because Labour is not people who drive trucks. It's people in, university towns who want to have cheap products. Yeah. And the more, you pay
this
workers.
Ties into, I've written more and more about China. And I think it's something that in the way we incorporated Soviet communism in our ideologies in the West, we must do that with China now, and we must all become experts on China, because the way our economy works is so intertwined with China and their internal and their domestic politics. So our cheap products is coming from China to a very large degree, and we are. If the more we get dependent on them, this was shown during COVID, and what happened during COVID is also that China strengthened their position, and it didn't result in solidarity between the West and China. It turned out to be quite the opposite, and one thing. What you have here is a few things that, like, we were promised on a macro level. We were promised that globalization, opening of markets, free trade, all that will in the end profit everybody. And then they sort of backtracked on that, like it will benefit most of the people most of the time. Yeah. And then it turns out that it might not benefit. It might benefit China the most. And it's benefited some companies in the West as well, like the owners of companies. And of course, there are benefits to free trade when it's actually free trade, which is not what we have with China. No. We have an awful trade deal, and this was one of the
very worst
The very
terrible
worst.
trade deal.
Yes.
If I was in office, you know, I'd make the best deal ever.
Yes, and that was one of the things that Trump said that people should have listened to, and the experts on the subject actually agreed with him.
Yeah.
But because he was the orange man is bad, people said that they didn't agree with that in the EU. So we had Swedish politicians saying, no, we need to talk about it. Like, it's a sort of a disease we have. Like, we think that talking solves everything. But one other thing is that since the 90s, at least, we've had like a narrative that we will educate people. So you have our last, the prime minister before Stefan Löfven, Fredrik Reinfeldt for the Moderate Party, he said something to the likeness of, like, the industry, who works there anymore? And it's like probably the biggest part of the working job market still. But and he should have known that. But what he really expressed there was that if they're not losers in the now, they will be in the future, because this is a market that's disappearing. So you have this narrative that we will educate everybody to become like learn to code has been like a phrase that's been popularized, and it turns out that it's a lie. That's not the way things work. It's still many of the jobs that the working class and the middle class has is still there, and it's still the biggest growth, and there's still a growth, and still. But the shift has been to, instead of bettering, for example, the salaries for certain migrant for certain parts of the job market, you've had a narrative that educate yourself in this meritocracy that we live in, and you will benefit from it. But everybody else deserve their place. So I think we are also seeing like the end of, I hope, that narrative, that like banal meritocracy narrative that we've had. Like, we will educate everybody, and then we will be better off.
Yeah. And so in the UK, you had this campaign by the Party of the Workers saying, oh, you know, Brexit is really bad. It's going to really hurt like ordinary truck drivers. We shouldn't have it because like truck drivers are going to suffer. Then it happens, truck drivers get this huge wage increase because without sort of labor arbitrage through essentially like importing immigrants willing to do jobs for cheaper, downward pressure on wages lets up. And then, like, belatedly, Labour says, yeah, we're kind of lying about that. But look, if you live in a university town and you don't produce anything, and you don't, you know, drive things around or work at the railroad or something, the only thing you really care about is low prices. And a good way to get low prices is to pay the people that, you know, make stuff or move it around like slaves. And we aren't people who make stuff. We're people who, you know, make sure that the train company has a new sort of diversity and inclusion policy. We're knowledge workers. And this sort of split in the interest between the knowledge economy and the economy of production that, you know, Reinfeldt in Sweden had a fairly pernicious, like, he was clearly playing for the enemy team in a way. It's becoming more and more impossible to deny. And, you know, it's actually happened fairly rapidly. Like, if you think about someone like Jordan Peterson, who was a huge thing for five years ago. Today, like, he's still publishing and he has a fairly big following, but he's not sort of a cultural phenomenon all on his own anymore. And you can say this about the intellectual dark web, so-called, in general, because in many ways they're still stuck in this, like, we have the best ideas, just give us tenure at the university, just make us like the director of this NGO or whatever, and we'll replace the bad ideas with good ideas. While a lot of people in the right, and I would include you here, are kind of now drawing up like the connections between like this incredible growth of like administrators.
The professorial managerial class.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's not about. I mean, I have when the Occupy Wall Street. I'm not. I wasn't part of that movement in 2008. Was it 2009 around there?
9, I think.
Yeah, but they got some of the thinkers got something right. They said that the financial system is broken, and it will not change. And I thought that, of course, now we have a crisis. It will change. I mean, people will they will adapt, and it will be better. But it hasn't. Actually, it's gotten worse in some ways because they're more entrenched. They're more invested in that, like holding up the banks now. So in some ways, many of the things that they said, but one of the things that got popularized then was the top 1%, like the one we are the 99%. But I think you should probably think about the class of people we're talking about is probably around 20%.
Yeah.
And those people are they are the ones who use terms like, I'm not saying that you did it that way now, but they are the ones who talk about themselves like we are knowledge workers.
Yeah.
We are the creators, and we are the creative content creators and stuff like that.
Long-suffering, Twitter proletariat.
And
whatever.
really, that's like it's not true. We don't live in a knowledge economy.
Yeah.
We are still an industrial economy in most of the ways. It's still the biggest where the most jobs are still working class jobs. So one thing that has changed is that we have a very hard pressure in Sweden from immigrant labor coming from the outside, and that's something that both the left wing and the right wing government has colluded with each other to make possible. So I'm not a union friend, so to say, but I'm not an enemy either. But one thing you have done is that it's harder for people who follow the Swedish rules on the job market to get the jobs. So you can import because we are part of the EU, and you've made it harder for the people who are in the middle, and you've made it easier for the people who are like in the professorial managerial class and the content creating class, and the people on the bottom, like Foodora. They can bring the food to the big brains who think about everything, and the people in the middle have had a harder time.
Yeah,
but it's also something that I mean, if you ask people, youth, I remember my mom said she suggested to me, because I hated school for a while, and she suggested to me, maybe you should go to the university then. Maybe you should get another job. And I was so angry with her that she thought that, wow, don't you think I'm a really, really smart guy? I'm a really smart boy. So I should go to the university. But because she's working class to begin with, so she didn't look down on that. But I did. And lots of my peers did, and we thought that it was self-explanatory that we would go to the university and study bullshit subjects for 6 years, in my case. And then you have to unlearn a lot of the things, a lot of the woke stuff you learned at sociology, like I studied. I mean, of course, I learned some things that are useful, but the point is that we have a culture now. If you ask people in Great Britain, for example, they made a survey, and you asked people in the 50s, are you proud of your job? And do you think you contribute to the nation? And I think working class professionals, I think around 70% said, yes, I'm proud. And it was a much higher degree than the academics and the white collar jobs. But now it's like 15% or 20% says yes. So the pride and the feeling that you contribute has dropped considerably, and I think this is a big. This is not just. It's a part of a narrative structure that I think is destructive.
Yeah, and just as sort of.
Are we becoming more Marxist for every minute we're speaking now?
Yeah, we should actually end it so people don't get like
exactly.
Infected with
I thought this was
brain
going to
wars.
be a conservative meeting, and we're just talking about like unions and We need less fedora and more. We need to bring back the docks to Gothenburg.
Yeah, I mean, wait until you read like Karl Marx's private correspondence, where his daughter's new boyfriend is rumored to have like Moorish blood somewhere in the family tree, and Marx, being this very socially conservative person, says, you can come over for dinner if you make sure that your boyfriend behaves as is proper for a northern climate. And by that, I think he meant like, not destroy the furniture or whatever. So, I mean, there's
so there's room to be a racist even though you're a Marxist, you're trying to say?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look,
okay.
Like we can...
Oh, thanks for catering to your podcast guest.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know this is kind of your big thing, but to sort of end on a slightly more serious note, I think that just as Substack is this sort of transition in the sense that if you're on Substack, you're not like on a team necessarily, because the teams, they've kind of stopped working. Like they don't make as much sense as they used to. And even a party like the Tory party in the UK, which has navigated this sort of new world far better than most other parties on the right who are still trying to sort of get their bearings. Like they don't have, well, this is the new sort of concept to replace left versus right. And we're all in transition in some ways, and away from this, which you talked about, like, your mom saying, like, maybe you shouldn't go to university. Like, for the longest time, we've had this idea, kind of like, the French monarchy before the revolution, that if you have a college degree in whatever, you can just put someone who studied basket weaving at the head of, like, the power ministry. And because this guy is a college-educated basket weaver from Princeton, of course...
I would trust a basket weaver more than a guy from Princeton.
Oh,
nowadays.
yeah.
They're the most woke, like the Ivy League. But one thing I just... like with Substack, and I still... I'm not... I've never been a libertarian. That's not where I come from.
Thank God for that, I say.
But there is... Like, when you see how much this... woke culture has worked its way into different agencies and libraries and institutions, and the way I mean people like me are not getting invited to, like, I will not speak at no library has invited me or my co-author, not this book, not the book before. We're not part of the public sphere in that dimension. But people who write this kind of books, but when they are like positive, like if we have written a book about named The Gender Doctrine, it's really good.
No.
Then we would have been on a tour at libraries, at universities, but it hasn't happened for us. So we have to. One of the Peter Thiel is I'm not sure if he's a libertarian, but what he said a thing that stuck with me. Like, if you act like you're already free. So act like you're already living in a free world. And so that Substack is part of that. But I do think that we cannot forget that we have to fight these institutions in every way possible. Yeah. So we can't leave those institutions. We have to do two things at the same time. You have to take the power away from these institutions, the woke establishment in these that have taken over many of these public institutions. And if it's not possible to do it by legislation or by other ways, then perhaps you have to put it down, like put it out, and deconstruct it. But at the same time, you have to start making your own institutions. So you have to do two things at the same time.
Yeah, and this is just a process that is in some ways just beginning, but is actually like probably going to be very exciting and very like meaningful in a historical sense. That the right is starting to realize that you can't really replace the bad cultural Marxist Czechist with a based conservative Czechist. You sort of have to destroy the Czeka, because the Czeka is what produces the Czechists.
Yeah.
And these institutions with like these often quite parasitical knowledge workers, they will look after their own, even at the expense of truck drivers and nurses and doctors and, you know, small business owners and so on. And so this conflict between the commissars and like the workers or the ordinary people they're supposed to be representing is going to just grow more intense in the years and decades ahead, I think.
Yeah.
So, Comrade Ivar Arpi, thank you for this stimulating discussion.
Thank you. It's been nice to be a part of.
Yeah, and we will probably resume it in the not too distant future at some other venue. We'll just have to see. But these issues are not going anywhere.
Yeah.